In antiquity, this territory, today heavily anthropized, was a fertile plain crossed by the Lombra river, which, in Roman times, received part of the waters of the Olona river, diverted to Milan for the needs of the city. In 1272, with the construction of the Naviglio Grande, the stretch of the Lombra that reached the canal from the north was dried up, while the stretch south of the canal was used to regulate the floods of the Naviglio and took the name of Southern Lambro or Lambretto. It was probably here on the bank of the Lombra and on the road towards the Lomellina that the temple dedicated to Hercules once stood. The mythological hero had a few traits in common with the legendary figure of Saint Cristoforo. It was therefore no coincidence that the church, which in the 12th century took the place of the temple, was dedicated to the saint who had become a martyr under Emperor Decius. According to a Christian legend, a giant named Offero became Christian. Following the instructions of a hermit, he used to carry travelers across an impetuous river. One night he was awakened by the voice of a child, who begged him to carry him across the river. Helping himself with his long oak stick, the giant began to cross the rushing waters. However, the load on his shoulders became heavier and heavier. When he looked up, the giant saw that a golden halo surrounded the boy's head. He was carrying the Christ and the weight of the world on his shoulders. Jesus baptized him with the name of Cristoforo, meaning the bearer of the Christ. He became the symbol of the Christian who bears witness of his faith with unshakable determination through the storms of life. In 1270, when the Naviglio became navigable, the old church was replaced by the one we can see today. At the time, it had a single nave covered with a truss roof and a circular apse behind a round arch. Above the entrance, an oculus, whose traces are still visible in the masonry, gave light to the interior. In 1364, a hermit who lived in the vicinity, Pietro de Franzonis, from Tavernasco, had a shelter for pilgrims built near the church. In the same period, the beautiful terracotta portal was created, decorated with an elegant rose window. The architrave of the door is supported by two carved marble corbels. On the left one is the eerie image of a man with three faces. In 1398, some noble citizens of Milan obtained from the Duke Gian Galeazzo Visconti the concession of a plot of land immediately beside the church for the construction of a chapel dedicated to the saints John the Baptist, James, Christopher, and Christina. On the day dedicated to these saints, July 25th, had been fought in 1391 the Battle of Alexandria, in which Gian Galeazzo Visconti had defeated the Count of Armagnac, called in Italy by the Florentine. Contrary to a popular belief, this chapel was not built in fulfillment of a vote for ending a plague epidemic. The epidemic occurred later, in 1400. Above the portal of the church is a marble plaque with the emblems of the Duke Giovanni Maria Visconti, of the city, and of the Archbishop Pietro Filargo, the future Pope Alexander V. It bears the date of September 1st, 1405, the day of the church's consecration. 3 years later, these citizens, belonging to important Milanese families, obtained to establish a confraternity that would manage the chapel, administer its assets, and the donation of the faithful and of the bequeathed plots of land. Maybe also the Duke Filippo Maria Visconti, who came to power in 1412, was a member of the confraternity. The chapel has a single nave, with two bays covered with cross vaults and separated by a pointed arch. Above the doorway, surmounted by the coats of arms of the Visconti family and of Milan, there was probably a rose window, which was later walled up in order to increase the height of the portal. Behind the church, a sacristy with a square plan was built, covered with cross vaults. The pointed arch window is the original one. In the same period, the apse of the old church was lowered, and a pointed arch replaced the original one, traces of which can still be seen in the masonry. The old bell tower was raised, and a new belfry was built above a beautiful frame with crossed arches. On the top is a pine-cone spire made of rounded bricks. The church was entirely covered with frescoes, and a large canopy was probably meant to protect them. Unfortunately, very little remains of them. Traces of a St. Cristoforo to the left of the facade, and of a visitation attributed to the school of the Zavattari above the portal of the chapel. After the plague of 1630, several frescoes inside the church were covered by a coat of lime, while others were destroyed in order to merge the two churches or to open new windows. On the inner wall of the chapel's facade is a rare Lombard fresco of the early 15th century, with the signature of the author Bassanolo de Magistris. The fresco is on two levels. On the upper level is the Virgin Mary enthroned, with St. Cristoforo on the right and St. Anthony on the left, and two men kneeling at her feet. On the level below, Christ on the cross is shown, with two angels collecting his blood. Mary Magdalene is kneeling before the cross, while the pious women comfort the sorrow of Mary. On the right are St. John with folded hands and a bishop laying his hand on a devotee. Together with the two figures kneeling in the upper level, he was probably a member of the Alciati or the Landriani families, whose coats of arms can be seen at the edge of the fresco, and who were among those who had commissioned the works. Of the once numerous paintings that decorated this bay, the figure of a bishop with a green vestment can still be seen to the right of the window, possibly St. Ambrose, and on the adjoining wall is St. Cristoforo. Above the arch of the first nave, two figures of saints can be seen. The one on the right is St. Cristoforo. Also, the right wall of the chapel was covered with frescoes, but unfortunately only few traces of a glory of saints remain in the arch above the window, and the image of a bishop down to the right. With regards to the frescoes on the vaults, there are still traces of an adoration of the Magi and of the seven sleepers of Ephesus. In the second bay, the remains of a large crucifixion by the school of the Zavattari, partially destroyed by the positioning of a large altar dedicated to the Virgin Mary, can be seen on the back wall. The two lateral figures of the second bay are connected to it, marked by the same framing of white lilies. Noteworthy for the quality of the execution and for the devotion of which it has always been the subject is the Virgin with Child, shown in a case on the wall. A wooden sculpture of St. Cristoforo was recently placed on the floor, a nice work of a Lombard artist of the 16th century. On the right wall is a more recent fresco representing St. Roch. By entering the old church on the left wall, we can see the remains of a late 15th century painting depicting the Virgin and Child enthroned, surrounded by saints. Beside it, a better preserved fresco of the Virgin among four saints, from left to right, Roch, Anthony, Augustine and Sebastian. During the church restoration, completed in 2017, a portion of the coffered ceiling was removed, revealing the image of God the Father, who, together with the angel and the Virgin Mary, depicted on the triumphal arch, was part of a large fresco of the Annunciation. The frescoes in the apse can probably be attributed to the same author. They were altered by the opening of the large windows. Four figures of saints are painted on the semicircular wall. In the center, those of St. John the Baptist and St. James. On the sides, those of St. Catherine of Siena and of St. Christina. The introdos of the ogival ark is decorated with a series of tondi of the apostles. In the bowl-shaped vault of the apse, the frescoes show God, surrounded by the symbols of the four evangelists. The blessing Christ on the left side of the arch, detached from a building on which there is no information, was painted between the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century. The modern altar, which incorporates a millstone, reminds us of the confraternity that for centuries administered the church. This painting of the early 20th century by Mary shows the church of San Lazzaro Celso, just south of San Cristoforo, and gives an idea of the landscape only a few decades ago. The names of Foppette and Le Foppe, once belonging to two farmsteads nearby, derive from the word Foppa, meaning hollow, a toponym frequent in this fertile, water-rich plain. Today, only the Maggiore farmhouse and the ruins of the Campagnola remain of the many farmsteads that once dotted the landscape. The Filippona farmhouse was demolished to build the Osram building, now hosting the cultural center of the Zone 6 of Milan. Until the early years of the last century, San Cristoforo belonged to an agricultural area. Among the tasks of the confraternity was that of helping the poor by distributing 10 bushels of wheat on Christmas Day and on July 25th, the day dedicated to St. Christopher. The wheat was distributed at a farmhouse called La Samaritana. It was probably ground at the nearby mill of the Resica. The relics of St. Christopher, preserved in the church, were subject of a special devotion. In those days, the fun and leisure of the people intertwined with the religious services. In 1609, the Camaldolese monks took control of the church, and in 1625, the two buildings were merged by opening two arches in the wall that divided them. In order to increase the light, some rectangular windows were opened. A wooded ceiling was added to the old church. At the sides of the apse, two niches were built. They contain two wooden statues of St. Christopher. The oldest one, dating from the 14th century, can be seen today on a shelf in the left aisle. Several images of St. Christopher were painted on the walls of the church, both inside and outside, some of them of large dimensions, because a simple glance at the image of the saint was considered sufficient to obtain his protection on that day. During the plague of 1630, the church was used as a lazaret. Behind the sacristy, a chapel for the dead was built, an octagonal ossuary covered by a vault. The entrance was preceded by a portico on columns, which no longer exists. Due to the repeated floods of the Naviglio, like that of 1705, the floor of the church had to be raised. In 1784, with the suppressions decreed by Joseph II, the confraternity ceased to manage the church. San Cristoforo went from the supervision by the church of San Vincenzo in Prato to that of Santa Maria delle Grazie on the Naviglio. In the meantime, the city was growing, and the small country church found itself in a strategic area for the city. In January 1870, a new railway line connected the city of Vigevano to the station of Porta Genova in Milano. The line passed directly behind the church. In June 1884, the Porta Sempione railway yard was completed. 7 years later, the Southern Railway Ring connected the Porta Romana and the Rogoredo stations. The railway crossed the Naviglio not far from San Cristoforo on an iron bridge, which, flanked by a concrete bridge, will later be used for the vehicles of the new ring road. In November 1915, a railway junction between the railway ring and the station of San Cristoforo will be established, with a new iron bridge even closer to the church. In 1936, the track will be doubled. To the same period dates the canalization and the covering of the Olona River, which, following the avenues of the new ring road and passing under the naviglio near the church, flowed into the southern Lombra. Not far from the church was also the Torre delle Milizie, used by the notorious Brigade Aldoresega, a fascist militia. The tower was demolished after the war. The church was restored between 1929 and 1955. On that occasion, the original windows were restored by closing the more recent one, and the frescoes covered in the 17th century were brought to light. Today, the whole area is waiting to be converted into a urban park, a project which will finally grant to the church a peaceful future.